Hi everyone, welcome to the Tuesday Philosophy Club, which is supported by the Aurora Philosophy Institute and the Aurora Public Library. My name is Alla Marchenko, and I'm the Executive Co-Director and President of the Aurora Philosophy Institute. This is the last Tuesday meeting for 2021-22. Thanks to all of you for making this such a successful season. After the summer break, we will start again in September. And it is my privilege this evening to once again welcome Dave Barrows as our speaker on the topic Grading Ayn Rand. We have discussed Ayn Rand and her controversial contributions to philosophy quite a few times this past year. And Dave, as a former university teacher, is very well placed to grade her term papers. David is a capital director of the API in Ottawa. And he's a former director of industry and trade policy at the Ministry of Industry, Government of Ontario, and associate director of the public administration program at the Schulich School of Business, York University, Toronto. Over to you, Dave.
Oh, thank you, Alla. Good evening, everyone. Nice to have you all on board. As Alla said, I've been in the teaching business and grading business for close to 60 years now, so thought we'd take a crack at that. In terms of our colleague, she was born Rosenbaum, middle-class Jewish family in St. Petersburg, 1905. The Bolsheviks, of course, confiscated her father's pharmacy business, and she, like many others, faced some desperate conditions during that time. She visited the United States in 25 and decided that she was going to stay and not return. We could go back just a little bit, John.
Sure, I can. Yeah, I don't know what happened there, actually.
Yeah. She developed an interest in screenwriting, and she actually did some and was involved in American action movies, which is where she got a bit of her genre. She became an atheist, but anytime you read anything about her, she's still considered to be Jewish, whether she wants to or not. Next, please. As was pointed out, love-hated and quite controversial, a best-selling author, still very widely read today. She's a big picture person. She managed to make it on the U.S. Postal Service stamp in 1999, which is pretty good stuff. Her novels are well-read and still bestsellers. She remains kind of an oddity and an outlier. A bit of a cult figure, actually. Intellectuals, philosophers dismiss her for pulp fiction and pseudo-philosophy. Rand, interestingly enough, is able to offend both sides. The liberals dislike the pro-capitalist position, and the conservatives dislike her militant atheism, role and position on abortion and pornography, and of course, conservatives and liberals dislike her focus on individualism. Next, please.
You want me to go on? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
There we go.
So she rose in a period where you had conflicting totalitarian regimes. Not surprisingly, she figured out early that communism and Nazism were exactly the same thing, just from somewhat opposite directions. She, like many others, rejected the libertarian movement, which is very interesting. Nobody seems to like libertarians. She would start a conversation by saying, "Tell me your premises," which is a kind of in your face. And then she was dismissed as vindictive, insulting. Others saw her as idealistic. And as our colleague, our new friend just mentioned, reading her philosophy can be quite exhilarating. It's like watching an action movie with the Avengers. For all her popularity, few philosophers have taken her seriously, although she is entered in the Stanford, Penguin, and Routledge encyclopedias of philosophy. Next, please. She defended selfishness, rational self-interest, and rejected altruism. That's probably a bit strong, but given her premises, makes a reasonable amount of sense. That's why some people in the system find her exhilarating. We don't have to have guilt. We can purge ourselves from guilt, and we can go on with our lives. She was a proponent of individualism, and in an age of existential doubt, she offered a celebration of creativity, of the human mind, and the joy of life. She was, and remains, a big personality. Next, please. So, what is her philosophy? Well, her philosophy, next, please. It's called Objectivism, and it's pretty straightforward. Follow reason, work hard to achieve life's purpose and productivity, earn genuine self-respect with your fellow humans, treat others honestly and create value with them and for them, humans as heroic beings. You're here to be happy. You're here to reason. Reality exists independently of consciousness, which is important, and you experience reality through sense perception. Next, please. What's the epistemology? An emphasis on free will, which is the choice to think or not to think. Rationality, that's your ethics, that's your objective. Vehemently opposed to racism in all forms, obviously a strong proponent of feminism, and the right to legal abortion, free speech, and nonviolence. Next, please. Consciousness. You perceive that which exists. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. There's going to be something there. The mind does not create reality. It, in fact, just discovers reality. Consciousness is, in fact, identification, the metaphysical principle that existence is, in fact, identity. Next, please. Morality. You have to be moral for long-term survival. It's not a social contract, but it derives from heroic women and men working together and creating value for each other. Happiness is the ultimate purpose. A life of emotional fulfillment is worthwhile. Happiness involves virtue. There is virtuous, and it's rational. You need to maintain mental focus in all issues and choices. Next, please. Virtue. Charity, kindness, and generosity are not a major virtue or moral duty. They just, in fact, derive from your behavior. Whether one should help others is dependent upon your view of their value, your hierarchy of values. It's not appropriate to make sacrifices. One should not knowingly risk one's life for a stranger. Never sacrifice happiness for another. You can help others in an emergency if it's of some value to you, and voluntary contributions are, of course, permissible for those unable to function in a work environment. Next, please. The protagonists are heroes. This, of course, goes all the way back to Greek literature. We're talking about the Odyssey and the Iliad. striving to be your best, leading a life of integrity, colorful, and they succeed because of their virtue. This conditional nature of their reality gives rise to their moral values. And of course, the basic alternative is to choose between life and death. Metaphysically, the only thing that matters is constant action in order to live a long, healthy, and happy, and prosperous life. And values are determined by objective life needs. And the ethics is a requirement for human survival. Next. Rights, capitalism, the trade of principle in government. Force and mind are opposites. Don't get anywhere with a gun. The ideal society is of independent individuals who respect each other's rights to life, liberty, happiness, and prosperity. We trade value for value, materially and spiritually. And individual rights means that you're subordinating societal rights to moral law. That's the thing that matters. She criticizes both conservatives and liberals, as the Americans understand this term. Of course, the conservatives want to capture the spiritual and moral realm. Liberals tend to be more interested in material and economic realms, but of course that's changing as well as they move into moral values. Conservatives focus on the market, and they choose to ignore her when she talks about abortion, pornography, atheism, etc. It's argued that both sides really misunderstand that the human need to have freedom in both reigns is that what matters to Rand. Laissez-faire capitalism separates state and economy, and the same reasoning follows, of course, with separation of church and state. Government regulation of the market is responsible for corrupting state and market institutions. In the literature, this is sometimes referred to as state capture in public choice theory and in public administration, where you are into a system of granting and receiving favors, and you lose track of the public good. Next, please. Government is minimal. It's to protect you from criminality and to help enforce rights and contracts. The human mind, as hopefully we all agree, does not really function very well when forced or coerced. And any form of censorship, restrictions on pornography, opinion, worship, are unacceptable. People can say and think what they want. Next, please. Aesthetics, which we're not going to really talk much about today. We may revisit this at some later date, but aesthetics required to bring her vision into reality. It meets the fundamental need of expressing abstract concepts in a concrete form, and it transforms reality into comprehensive and comprehensible works of art. Next, please. So how are we going to assess her? We're going to look at metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. We'll leave aesthetics aside for the moment. We will use the methodology of the Schulich School of Business, where an A+ is a 9, A is an 8, etc., all the way down to C-, which is a 1. So that's the grading scheme that John Smithon recommended in memory of the Schulich School of Business. Next, please. Metaphysics, I give her an A+. Well, why is that? Existence precedes essence. That's the central claim of existentialism. It reverses the traditional philosophical view that essence, the nature of things, is more fundamental than is mere existence. It's the fact of being. If you could go back, John, please.
Yeah, sorry. I think I did something, you know.
These things happen. We all do something sometimes. Anyway, if you look at the diagram, you're here. It's a very tiny speck in a very big place. The diameter of the universe is 93 billion light years. That's a big place. And you're right smack in there, barely noticeable. Next, please. Well, what does that mean? If essence creates existence, well, when did that happen? Well, scientists agree that Homo habilis was the creator of the universe. Those are the earliest humans, and they lived a couple of million years ago. So therefore, the consciousness of Homo habilis created the universe. They looked up into the sky and they saw nothing. It was all dark, gloomy. There was nothing there until they said, Umaguma. And once they said Umaguma, then everything lit up. Everything lit up. And so philosophers would tell you that for 13 plus billion years before Homo sapiens appeared on this planet, there was no experience whatsoever. Nothing was seen, touched, felt, or known. And of course, without the capacity to detect anything or distinguish it from nothing, there's no real difference between a universe without consciousness and a universe that does not exist, which is, of course, incomprehensible. Next, please. How about epistemology? Well, here we're getting into some a bit of a mixed bag in terms of where Rand is coming from. Next, please. Well, much of her work, of course, depends upon rational thinking. And one would say, well, that's pretty straightforward, but that's not necessarily. There are some disciplines, economics, cognitive science, biology, which assume that humans and animals have unlimited information, unlimited computational power, and unlimited time to make decisions. Unbounded rationality decisions follow expected utility theory, which you maximize, of course, and it becomes optimal and fully rational. Of course, that doesn't work. Humans and animals have limited resources to make inferences. And so we're into bounded rationality, which is heuristics, the use of thumb. Many years ago, Simon, of course, talked about decision makers as satisficers. Tversky and Kahneman got into the idea of framing. People respond differently to how you frame the situation. For example, you avoid risk when there's a positive frame, but seek risk when you have a negative frame. Interestingly, this framing also occurs in primates. Now, Kahneman is an interesting character. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. Now you might say, well, so what? Well, he's not an economist. The economics profession was such a mess with its emphasis on rational thinking that the Nobel Committee gave the prize to Kahneman, who's a psychologist, because he was getting at the truth, as we understand it, of decision-making processes. Next, please. John? Right. Perceptual decision-making strategies are the same between a mouse and humans. How they make decisions might entail alternating strategies between a series of events. This is published by the folks at Princeton University in Nature and Neuroscience, which is a very prestigious journal. Mice and humans switch between engaged and disengaged strategies. Why do they do that? Because disengaged strategies may require less energy due to finite energy budgets to perform tasks. That's right, mice and men. Behavioral genetics. This is fairly straightforward. Behavioral traits and disorders are influenced by your genes. The environment influences tend to make members of the same family more different than more similar. And the influence of genetics tends to increase in importance as we get older. Now, that's why I gave her a B. The rationality stuff is great, but the world doesn't really work that way. As you can tell, you'll hear people say, well, any rational human being would conclude this. What they really mean to say is any rational human being who has my genetic makeup and has been involved in my environmental situation would think the way I do. That's what they define as rational. Ethics, B+. What's going on here? And I think people don't really understand this. Rand, although she may not admit it herself, is a utopian. It's a utopian vision. And a utopia derives from Thomas More, of course. It's a fictional place where the members of the society have perfected certain qualities. In common parlance, it sometimes means impossible or far-fetched. So usually they're okay in terms of equality and economics, government justice, but of course you do have techno-dystopian utopias, Brave New World, 1984. The method and implementation of utopias tends to vary depending on the ideology. People like utopias. Victor Hugo liked utopias. Oscar Wilde liked utopias. Marx, who is probably the ultimate utopian, used the word utopia to denote unscientific social theories. Next, please. Well, what's Rand talking about? Well, Thomas Paine says, look, rights cannot be granted by a charter because that implies that it can be revoked. Rights would only be privileges. In other words, Paine is saying Rand is right. That's the fundamental basis. Winston Churchill's famous dictum is democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. And Rand, and I would argue that that applies to the capitalist system as well. The capitalist system is a mess, but it certainly performs better than any other system. Now, what about all this selfishness business? Isaac Asimov, the famous scientific fiction writer, one of his laws is robots shall avoid actions or situations that could cause it to come to harm itself. So in other words, that's the kind of thing Rand is talking about. We don't do self-harm. Next. This has always bothered me. When you get on a plane and you sit down and they get on and they say, you know, oxygen and air pressure monitored, the compression, a mask will appear. And here's the troubling one that always bothers me to this day. If you're traveling with a child or someone who requires assistance, secure your mask, then assist the other person, which of course, on the face of it, sounds horrible. I had to bring my mother back to Boston after she had a massive heart attack, and I'm hearing this saying, no, put the mask on my mother first. And the answer is no, you don't do that because you can't help somebody else unless you help yourself. Camus, who is probably the ultimate existentialist or absurdist, if you will, there's only one truly serious philosophical problem, that's suicide. Now, people are saying, well, you need to be empathetic. You know, you really have to, walk in the other person's moccasins. You really have to understand them and feel for them. However, and this is a literature, which isn't made up, there's a very dark side to empathy if you overdo it. If you're too much in tune with other people's emotions, it can lead to exhaustion, apathy, and even aggression and cruelty. I got this one off of the BBC a couple of months ago, but there's an extensive literature on that. You can overdo empathy, go too far. Next, please. So Yuan's utopian vision, from my perspective, it's as good as any. But I mean, really, in its pure form, it works very well, given her major premise, which is humans are never helpless and they're never dependent through fault of their own. So based on that premise, it's noble, it's kind-hearted, it's consistent, free women and men living in harmony, racial and sexual equality, freedom of speech, a vision for a better world, and of course, many of the components, as we know, exist in society. Next, please. However, there's a problem. Pastor Mueller, was having trouble figuring out how to live a long life. Now, the pastor was an ardent nationalist and was very pro-Nazi, which he acknowledges himself. He says he wasn't a member of the party. Others said he was, but it doesn't really matter. What did Pastor Mueller have to say for all this? First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Pastor was arrested in 1934 and sent to Dachau. Dachau in those days, as I understand it, was for German political prisoners. It was only later that it took on a more sinister form. And the pastor was released by the Allies in 1945. And he then went around making speeches, talking about first they came for. How do you live a long life? Well, Emerson says it's not the length of your life that matters, but it's the depth. It's not how long you live, it's what you've done with it, how deep it is. So that's why I gave her a bit of an explain. Next, please. Politics. I give her a B plus. B plus. Well, why is that? Not? Why is that? Well, we have a guy named John Locke, and he's considered the father of the Enlightenment. He is highly valued. He is considered one of the top 5 philosophers ever. Top 5 philosophers ever. What did he talk about? The value of human happiness, pursuit of knowledge by reason, evidence of the senses, liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, natural rights were inalienable. Like Hobbes, Locke believed that human nature allows people to be selfish. All people are equal and independent with a natural right to defend health, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Unused property was wasteful, offense against nature, and that property is a natural right. He, as you know, influenced the United States Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, but they changed it from property to happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Canada, of course, is all about good government. When people ask what's the difference. Next. There's only one problem with Locke. He was a slave owner. He believed in slavery. He invested in the Royal Africa Company, and he helped to write the Constitution for Carolina. Carolina planters have absolute power over their enslaved chattel property, that means human beings. The Constitution pledges that every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. So he believed in slavery. He also really liked child labor. He said children of laboring people are a burden to the parish, and they are usually maintained in idleness, so they don't really start to work till they're 12 to 14. So what he said is we should set up working schools in each parish so that poor children can get to work from the age of 3. Now, when my children were the age of 3, I was really happy that they were toilet trained. So I started to think about, well, how would you get a 3-year-old to work? And it's very simple. You torture them physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, until they just work without crying or thinking or anything. That's the only way I can see doing child labor. Next, please. So what's going on? He's considered the father of liberalism. Rand's philosophy is, of course, based on Locke, which he acknowledges. But Rand did not believe in racism or child labor. Locke is considered a great philosopher, but not Rand. How come? Well, Locke's parents were Protestant. He went to Oxford, got lots of degrees at Oxford, including medicine. He was a doctor. And it's, of course, a case of argumentum ad hominem. Here you have this Russian Jewish woman who was a screenwriter, and you're comparing her to John Locke, even though they're saying almost the same thing, with the exception of slavery and child labor. Next, please. Now, here's a problem for Rand, which is market failure. Free markets fail. Everybody knows that. The most conservative economists will tell you that free markets fail in the provision of public goods, information asymmetries, oligopoly and monopoly, and externalities like pollution. Now, real conservatives will then say, yeah, well, that's okay, but the market is better. Anytime government intervenes, they make it worse. But everybody agrees the market fails. Now, what does that mean? Well, at the apex of the free enterprise capitalist system in America that Rand glorifies and loves so much, they passed antitrust legislation. The Sherman Act actually came into play in 1890, if you can believe it. No place in the world would even consider such a thing. The whole world was just oligarchs, which is what Rockefeller was on his way to becoming. And they passed the Sherman Act and they broke them up. They broke them up. So even at the height of American capitalism that Rand glorifies, people understood that market power is a very dangerous kind of thing. Next, please. Well, you know, we've got lots of government there. We have lots of power structures: anarchy, confederation, unitary, oligarchy, aristocracy, theocracy, people's republic, monarchy, world government. You've got lots and lots of forms of government. Lots of forms of government. Next, please. Next, please, Joe. Thank you. And we've got lots of isms, socioeconomic isms. We have capitalism, we have colonialism, we have feudalism, communism, federalism, and socialism, which is not a welfare state. Socialism, its real form, means that the means of production are commonly owned by the people and undertaken for use rather than for profit. So we've got all this government. We have all these different permutations and combinations. Next. Which of course raises the question, if you've got all these power structures and socioeconomic attributes, why have we not found the right combination? Since Homo habilis 2 million years ago, we've had lots of opportunity to put this thing together properly. Well, there's a little bit of democracy, there's some theocracy, we have a bit of socialism, there's some capitalism. You would have thought the right combination would have emerged someplace, somehow. And it hasn't. And then the question, of course, is why not? And the answer is very simple. The right combination doesn't exist. There is no right combination. That's why we haven't found one, and we never will. Well, then the question is, how come? Why not? Next, please. And the answer is very simple. The problem isn't with the system, although some systems are better than others, of course. It's people. People are the problem. That's where the problem is. A former moderator is suing YouTube for failing to protect workers who remove violent videos. There's people who get up every morning, and that's their job, is to remove violent videos before they go on YouTube. If you think some of the stuff on YouTube is bad now, you have no idea. Prior to employment, this is just sort of their introductory inoculation period, they would watch murder, abortions, child rape, animal mutilation, and suicide. Then when they started their job, it got worse. And you can't imagine in your wildest nightmares what people try to post on YouTube. It's unbelievable. Now, of course, people are going to say, well, that's of course because of the capitalist system. If we have capitalism, none of this would happen. And the answer is no, not really. This stuff is posted all around the world, in every system, in every society. It's simply awful, just unbelievable. Slavery, defined, and they estimate there's about 40 million slaves around the world, 10 million of which are children. Now people are going to say, well, that's capitalism for you. Well, if we didn't have capitalism, we wouldn't have slavery. And the answer is, well, no, not really. Because the slaves tend to occur in one part of the world which has had slavery almost since the beginning of time. In the old days, you could mention that, but of course now that's impossible because under the current environment. But Wikipedia doesn't seem to be quite as sensitive to these things. So you can go to Wikipedia and they'll tell you exactly what part of the world is dominated by slavery. But I would say, of course. Now here's a good one. Amartya Sen, who's an economist and philosopher, Indian originally, now he's at Harvard, 88 years old, won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1998, I guess. So he was playing around with some numbers, which is what most academic economists do. And he said, well, here's a number of people in Asia, here's the number of men, and here's the number of women. And he had one of those uh-oh moments. He said, uh-oh, this doesn't work. There should be more women because it's sort of 50-50, that's what it is. And so when he started pushing the numbers around, he found out that there were 100 million women missing in China, South and West Asia. Women who should be there, but do not exist. Now, how did that happen? Well, it's very simple. The ultrasound machine comes into the village, and the scan takes place, and the technician says, well, congratulations, looks like you're going to have a happy, healthy little boy. And the response is, yeah, that's good. But then she says, or he says, congratulations, you're going to have a happy, healthy little girl. And then the woman says, well, we'll see about that. And then they go have an abortion. Now, this is not a discussion of the rights or wrongs of abortion. I don't want to go there, okay? All I'm talking about is selective abortion based on gender alone, okay? But if abortion, well, females' right, whatever, that's fine. If you don't have an ultrasound machine and the child is born, then you kill it. It's called female infanticide, which basically means murder. And most people would agree that once the child is born, the mother loses all rights with respect to the child. Now, one would say, well, okay, that's the guys, the husbands do that. And the answer is no, that is not the case. The mothers do this. This is female infanticide, and the mothers do this. They have a very special technique for doing it, which I won't mention. It's rather delicate, but they do it. And if they don't do that, then there's, of course, inadequate health care, malnutrition, female children. Now, somebody's going to say, well, that's the capitalist system for you. We didn't have capitalism, we'd have 100 million more women. And the answer is no. This has absolutely nothing to do with the system. This is much more fundamental than that. No need to go into that discussion, but that's just what it is. Next, please. So, how can we conclude all of this? What does it all do? Next, please. So what can we say about Objectivism? Well, the best countries in the world, in fact, incorporate Rand's ideals. Now, I was going to list these countries, but I was told in no uncertain terms that that's politically incorrect and that would be offensive to people. So if you want to know what these countries are, you can go to the Human Development Index, which is published by the United Nations. So when you see the list and you're offended by it, you can write to the United Nations and tell them it offends you. There's millions of lists on the internet, and they all look pretty much the same. Transparency International measures countries by their transparency, by their corruption, level of corruption. Unsurprisingly, countries with a high Human Development Index are more transparent and less corrupt. I won't mention them because that's not politically advisable in this environment. Well, what do they exhibit? Well, they exhibit a form of capitalism where the government promotes entrepreneurship with lots of rules and regulations, but they still do. There's relatively limited state ownership of the means of production. Democracy, freedom of expression is there, sort of. There's a rule of law. There's an attempt to promote equality. There's an attempt to promote property rights. So a lot of the things that Rand talks about, one tends to find in the best countries in the world. However, if we go to the bottom, and of course this is the crux of the matter, with the addition of a social safety net for humans dependent through no fault of their own. And so, yes, Rand is right about a lot of stuff, but her initial assumption of happy, healthy, more people, unfortunately, does not exist. And there is a need for a social safety net. In the United States, my sister-in-law was in a social safety net, and my brother. My sister-in-law was out of the social safety net for 60 years of her life because she was profoundly schizophrenic. And my brother was severely impacted by multiple sclerosis and was unable to work. Next, please. So the final grade, when you add it all up, is a B+, solid B+. A lot of what she says is terrific. Her assumptions, her utopian assumptions, are not completely valid, and that's why she's a B+. Now, you can see why she's so widely admired, because much of the stuff that she talks about is really exhilarating. It gives you a sense of empowerment. When you go to the movies, in my day, you used to go to see Bergman, who was I'm not the most exciting guy in the world. But nowadays, of course, everybody goes to see the Avengers or Spider-Man because everybody wants a hero. Everybody needs a hero, and Rand talks about heroism. That's the basis of her discussion. So that's where I am on it. I want to thank you all for your attention. Hopefully the presentation went reasonably smoothly between John and myself. And I guess we now open it up for discussion.